Hello, everyone. My name is Matias Grignola, and today I will be talking about open source. So, to begin, here's the agenda. First off, I'll talk about the idea, then the history, licensing, the way people use it. I'll talk about an example. I'll talk about Linux. I'll talk about some other supporters of open source, and then influences and the future. So what is open source? It is the appropriation and free sharing of creations and modifications. So source code is the physical nitty gritty of what this is. You need source code to build open source software, which is the final product of open source technologies. So origins. Um, Open source emerged out of a free software movement who were critical of the political agenda and moral philosophy of proprietary software. Um, they decided to reframe their position to reflect a more commercially minded position um, so that people could use software freely and use it for commercial and personal use without all the restrictions from software companies. Christine Patterson actually coined the term free software movement in Palo Alto, California. And the movement began as an alternative to all the proprietary software and the limitations that came with it. So, progression and development. Um, so, open source has spread to many fields since the 1980s, as you can see in the chart. Just overall usage has increased a lot. Um, in many different fields, such as like research and medical and business models and personal home use. It's just been increasing a lot, um, and since the internet, there's been a lot of companies and programs that have come out. So the number of programs has increased as well. So out of this open source came the Open Source Initiative. So it's a global nonprofit run organization that protects and promotes open source content um, through education, collaboration of multiple organizations, and aiding in the infrastructure of many open source repositories. They protect the open source definition, which I will talk about later, and aid in the prevention of abuse of this content, which can be detrimental to the whole open source movement. Since everything is so readily accessible, it's easy to take open source content, use it for your own personal gain or legal purposes. So, when it comes to open source software, there needs to be licensing to allow people to use this. And when it comes down to licensing, to get a license for a company to be able to license out their technology, it has to meet an open source definition. Um, and then the open source definition is um, is basically criteria that has to be followed. So all licenses must have free redistribution, which makes sense since it's open software to be used by everyone and anyone. It must have a source code and derived works so that it can progress and people can apply it to different programs, create new programs that are compatible, um, that sort of thing. And it also needs to have integrity, so it cannot be created with malicious intent or the idea of using it for legal purposes. Um, Whereas there are some things it has to have. The open source definition may not discriminate against other people or groups, which is pretty self-explanatory. It cannot discriminate against fields or endeavors, which hasn't been that big of an issue either, since people in many fields have come up with their own open source programs and software. It cannot be specific to a certain product, because once it becomes specific to a certain product, that's when it becomes proprietary and gives an unfair advantage to certain companies. It cannot restrict other software, which again, it becomes proprietary if your operating system does not allow for open source programs. And it cannot be technologically neutral, so it has to work with a wide range of applications, um, not just a specific one. So, usage and why it was created. It was created to have more collaboration, so to speak. So, um, with open source, many people can better the program, better the user experience, things of that nature. It also unifies projects. So if everyone has access to a certain software, due to it being free, um, then projects are more streamlined and more efficient, things like that. However, there's a lot of misuse when it comes to open source software. Forked versions of software is when um, there are people that take a version of software and then use it for their own gain, make a different copy, and don't release it publicly. People do this when they want to use a certain software for illegal purposes, which is not okay, which is not allowed by the open source definition. An example is Kodi. Kodi is an open source media player. It is an alternative to programs like iTunes and Windows Media Player. It can, just like iTunes and Windows Media Player, it can play your local libraries, music and videos and things of that nature. Or you can install streaming services onto it like Netflix and Amazon Video. Um, all these additions, like installing streaming services, that has been done by the user base. People have figured out ways to do this and have made Kodi into a one-stop shop for video and media. The cool thing about Kodi is that it works on most operating systems, including Android, Mac OS, Linux, Windows, Apple TV, Raspberry Pi as well. Um, it's a program that you can install onto most applications. Um, so Linux is the biggest open source operating system there is. Um, it was first developed for personal use as an operating system for a personal computer, and there have been many derivations that have been released publicly, as you can see here. Um, and many open source projects start off on Linux, since Linux is the biggest open source operating platform. But there are also many other supporters of open source. Um, so when there's a certain application, there is bound to be an open source version of that. For instance, there are multiple internet browsers, there are multiple media players, email clients, things like that, word processors. So most things have alternatives. Inspirations. So open source has increased transparency and liberty in research. Since people have access to the software, people can modify it and use it to better research and things of that nature. It has Open source has expanded open source hardware movement as well. So now people know what goes into the making of actual hardware. And the open source initiative is going to keep on growing due to the rapid progress open source is seen as a whole. These are the sources I used, and if you have any questions, refer to the internet. It's open. So yeah, thank you very much.